The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. The named is the mother of 10,000 things. Ever desireless, one can see the mystery. Ever desiring, one can see the manifestations. These two spring from the same source, but differ in name. This appears as darkness. Darkness within darkness, the gate to all mystery. That was chapter 1 of the Tao Te Ching, a text written some 2,500 years ago by the legendary Chinese sage Lao Tzu, a figure that many place alongside the Buddha, Krishna, and Christ. The meaning of the word Tao is impossible to capture in language. Metaphysically, it is understood to be the source from which all arises, beyond time, space, and form. Psychologically, it is the way human nature is constituted, the deep dynamic structure of our being. Ethically, it is the way we must act towards nature and other human beings. It is the great way of life itself. Yet even these definitions fail to encompass the full scope of the Tao, as the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. That first line speaks volumes, as it points to a much deeper and more expansive phenomenon, a phenomenon which I'll be attempting to unpack here. Beyond just Taoism, what we find throughout the world's great religions appear to be the same concepts veiled in different language depending on the time and culture. The Tao of the Tao Te Ching that Lao Tzu spoke of is but one lens, one perspective, of an unfathomable something that the sages, theologians, and mystics of all ages have been painstakingly grasping towards for thousands of years. In this video, we'll explore the Perennial Philosophy, a worldview that suggests all the great spiritual traditions of the world are rooted in a single, timeless truth. We'll explore the esoteric and mystical roots of the major religions with quotes from various theologians and mystics. We'll also explore the dark side of organized religions, its tendency toward dogma, power, and division, along with its transformative potential. This is an invitation to a new perspective, a view of the diverse forms of culture that has the intention to unite and connect. And with that, let's begin. The Perennial Philosophy has a long and complicated history. At its core, it is the belief that the common themes shared by religions around the world are pointing to actual truths about the nature of reality, consciousness, and the purpose of humanity. It is called the Perennial Philosophy because just like a perennial flower, the core ideas behind it continue to bloom across times and cultures. In the same way that one genre of music couldn't possibly express the full scope of musicality, so it is said that any one religion couldn't possibly express the full scope of God. Perennialism has its earliest roots in the 15th century with thinkers like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, who suggested that truth can be found in many traditions. Both of these thinkers believed there to be a unity to the world, far deeper than the apparent diversity of things, and they sought to integrate biblical, Aristotelian, Islamic, and Kabbalistic teachings into a single coherent system. However, it wouldn't be until after their death that the Italian humanist Agostino Stoico would coin the term philosophia perennis, a Latin term meaning eternal philosophy. In the centuries that followed, this idea would be further refined by major figures like Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and later echoed poetically by William Blake, whose 1788 work All Religions Are One reflected the same perennial insight. The 20th century English writer and philosopher Aldous Huxley, most famously known for his books Brave New World and The Doors of Perception, is one of the key figures that brought the Perennial Philosophy to mainstream attention in the West. It's important to mention that perennialism lies at the intersection of several different schools of thought, most chiefly that of traditionalism. From what I could gather, many traditionalists don't entirely agree with Huxley's interpretation of perennial wisdom. Traditionalists like René Guénon emphasized a strict metaphysical hierarchy and viewed modernity as a fall from primordial unity, while Huxley was a bit more optimistic about the modern potential for a synthesis of spiritual ideas. Upon reading his book, I found it to be particularly illuminating and believe he did well in explaining its core ideas. It seems like the disagreements between thinkers in this school of thought might speak to the subtle irony of perennialism in general. The perennial philosophy is not a religion, but oftentimes its proponents can become quite dogmatic about it, insisting that there are specific rules and ways to think about it. I believe this misses the point entirely. Put simply, the perennial idea remains. At the core of the great religions is the same universal truth. Huxley writes, "The perennial philosophy is primarily concerned with the one divine reality substantial to the manifold world of things and lives and minds. But the nature of this one reality is such that it cannot be directly and immediately apprehended except by those who have chosen to fulfill certain conditions, making themselves loving, pure in heart, and poor in spirit." In the 1920s, Huxley took an interest in Vedanta, a mystical and philosophical branch of Hinduism. He became immersed in these ancient scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Sutras, and the Upanishads, wherein many statements would prove to be foundational to his later writings on perennial philosophy. In the Upanishads are found the great sayings, such as Tat Tvam Asi, thou art that, and Ayam Atma Brahma, this self, Atman, is Brahman. These sayings elucidate how Hindu sages understood the innermost self, or Atman, to be identical to Brahman, the absolute principle and essence of all things, aka the Godhead. The final end of each individual, it is said, is to realize this for oneself. Huxley saw the teachings of the East to most succinctly exemplify the core ideas of perennial wisdom. Indeed, if there were any religion that espoused its core ideas long before it was given that name by Stoico in the 16th century, it would certainly be Hinduism. Truth is one. The sages call it by many names. Writing between the intermission between the First and Second World Wars, Huxley was adamant on finding a way to foster world peace. Seeing firsthand the damage caused by religious imperialism, he became critical of organized religion's tendency toward evangelical subordination, describing it as not only absurd and discreditable, but socially dangerous and a barrier to world peace. His book on the perennial philosophy was written at the height of World War II, before it was clear who would win. Huxley gave special importance to the experiential aspect of perennialism, while those from the more traditionalist school focused primarily on metaphysics. His focus on the direct experience of the divine wasn't due to his famous mescaline trip as some have suggested, as it wouldn't be until several years after writing this book that he would have the experience he wrote about in The Doors of Perception. It's worth noting that some of the core ideas within the perennial philosophy have grown out of older philosophical traditions. Since I have not studied every philosophical tradition and am limited to the research I can do within the month or so that I spend writing these scripts, I will generally be sticking to the core ideas as illustrated in Huxley's work, with a few additional insights here and there. What can be said is that many of these perennial ideas stem from a major transitionary period in human history, a period that the philosopher and psychoanalyst Karl Jaspers called the Axial Age, a subject we'll return to later on. For now, in order to properly understand the core ideas, we must first understand the difference between immanence and transcendence. When we say something is immanent, it means that it is fully present or intrinsic within the material world. Immanence is that which exists within the bounds of time and space, woven into nature and the fabric of existence. In contrast to immanence is transcendence, which refers to things outside the purview of space, time, and form. The transcendent lies beyond the reach of the senses, independent of the material world and physical laws, and is ineffable by definition. While many modern iterations of religion believe that God is only transcendent, that is, residing in a domain that is outside of themselves and the world, perennial wisdom teaches that God is both immanent and transcendent, existing in and through each individual, in all of nature, while also transcending time and space. Insofar as God is understood to be omnipresent, in the real definition of that word, we can see how perennialism and panentheism are in fact deeply interconnected ideas. To understand God solely as an overseer outside of earthly affairs is, in many ways, to limit our direct apprehension of reality. The world becomes a theophany, a direct experience of God, when seen as both immanent and transcendent. The first key concept within the perennial philosophy is that of the divine ground. This refers to the ultimate source of all existence, the underlying uniting principle of all things. Virtually every religion and philosophical framework recognizes this, albeit using different terms. In Hinduism, it is called Brahman, the infinite, formless ground of being. In Mahayana Buddhism, it appears as Dharmakaya, the truth body of the Buddha that pervades all things, or as Sunyata, often translated as emptiness, vacuity, or voidness, which is the dynamic ground of interdependence. Zen Buddhists often describe it as no thingness, a direct pointing to what cannot be grasped by the intellect. Blank scrolls are the true scriptures. Christian mystics call it the Godhead, the groundless ground of being, that which is beyond all images or concepts of God. For Sufis, it is al-Haq, meaning truth and ultimate reality. It is the Tao of Taoism, Ein Sof in Judaism, and in Neoplatonism it is simply called the One. This divine ground, whether called the Godhead, Tao, or Brahman, is understood to be fully immanent and transcendent. While the tendency to anthropomorphize or personify God is less common in Eastern religions compared to the West, we can see that the underlying metaphysical qualities of the Godhead are virtually identical across traditions. These are not gods in the mythological sense, but rather individual expressions of the same infinite source. Metaphysical principles, we might say. Like a white light passing through a prism giving rise to different colors, the light of the divine ground passes through the prism of culture, time, and language to show its different colors. In all faces is shown the face of faces, veiled and in a riddle. Intimations of this divine ground can be found in the Bible. For example, Acts 17 verse 28, "For in him we live and move and have our being." Colossians 1 verse 16 to 17, "All things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together." Ephesians 4 verse 6, "One God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all." Several centuries before Christ, the Upanishads spoke of a similar idea. That which is the subtle essence. In it, all that exists has itself. It is the true, it is the self, that thou art. According to these ancient texts, you are that, meaning there is essentially no difference between that which makes you, you, and that which makes everything else, everything else. The Tao Te Ching likewise affirms this, wherein it says, "The Tao begot one, one begot two, two begot three, and three begot the 10,000 things. The 10,000 things carry yin and embrace yang. They achieve harmony by combining these forces. All things under heaven are born of the tangible. The tangible is born of the intangible." The perennial philosophy teaches that it is through our sense of self that we lose touch with this ground of all being. The one becomes the many, and the many become one. Separation, individuality, selfness, and ego, these are illusory. This fragmentation into egoic individuality, this forgetting of the ultimate source and interconnectedness of all beings and things, lies at the very core of human suffering. Maya is understood to be the force that creates the cosmic illusion that the phenomenal world is real. Our descent from unity and oneness into the physical, corporeal world is our descent into the illusion of separation. Look within, thou art the Buddha. According to the perennial wisdom, that which gives everything its essence is the same thing that gives us our essence. Consciousness is not simply a curious byproduct of complex brain chemistry. We are, in essence, a divine spark disguised as individuals. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female he created them. This verse gave way to the concept of the imago Dei, or image of God. The precise meaning of Genesis 1 verse 27 has been debated for millennia. But in this context, it bodes quite well with the Hindu notion that Atman is Brahman. When Christ says that the kingdom of heaven cannot be entered except by those who are little as children, it means that one undertakes the difficult journey of self-denial and ego dissolution to become childlike once again. Children are closest to source, closest to the embryonic oneness with the mother, and it's through this world of pain and pleasure that we build our walls of selfhood and lose touch with the original ground of being. Learn to look with an equal eye upon all beings, seeing the one self in all. Huxley beautifully describes this process of selflessness when he says that one cannot know created nature in all its essentially sacred beauty unless one first unlearns the dirty devices of adult humanity. Seen through the dung-colored spectacles of self-interest, the universe looks singularly like a dung heap, and as, through long wearing, the spectacles have grown onto the eyeballs, the process of cleansing the doors of perception is often painfully like a surgical operation. In other words, when we see everything through the lens of self-interest, we won't be able to see the divine all around us. He elaborates on William Blake's famous saying as well, when he said, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite." In states of deep contemplation, this has been realized by mystics and sages throughout history. In Eastern traditions, liberating oneself from the chains of worldly desires and concerns is called non-attachment, and for the West, this same idea is known as holy indifference. That liberation or deliverance happens within, rather than in an afterlife state of indefinite personal survival, is clearly affirmed in the East. For the West, it isn't quite as explicit. The kingdom of God is within you, so it is said in the book of Luke. The Gospel of Thomas, an apocryphal text that was excluded from the Bible, takes this notion even further. Quote, "Jesus said, 'If those who lead you say to you, 'See, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will become known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. But if you will not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and it is you who are that poverty." The writings of the 13th century mystic and theologian, Meister Eckhart, contain a wealth of esoteric wisdom. Eckhart spoke of the importance of direct experience and inner transformation as the true path to God, and later in his life these teachings caused him to be accused of heresy. He did not think of God as a being among or outside of beings, but rather as being itself. Quote, "This treasure of the kingdom of God has been hidden by time and multiplicity and the soul's own works, or briefly by its creaturely nature. But in the measure that the soul can separate itself from this multiplicity, to that extent it reveals within itself the kingdom of God. Here the soul and the Godhead are one." What we find within the mystical traditions around the world is a recurring theme about the nature of the soul being identical with the nature of God. Bearing this in mind, the verse, "I and the Father are one," appears to mean something much more profound than orthodox interpretations. This is what Eckhart means when he says, "As the Godhead is nameless, and all naming is alien to him, so also the soul is nameless, for it is here the same as God. The nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. According to Lao Tzu, the Atman is equivalent to Brahman. The self is equal to the ultimate reality, as the Hindus realized so many millennia ago." A famous quote by the Sufi poet and mystic, Rumi, sums it up well. "You are not a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop." According to the Perennial Philosophy, the purpose of life is to attain the unitive knowledge of God. From unity into multiplicity, the path and goal of life in the material world is to remember the ultimate source and oneness with the divine ground of all being. Eastern traditions strongly emphasize that one must realize this for oneself, as simply being told this is not enough to actually know it. This is knowing with a capital K, an understanding that reaches beyond the merely rational and intellectual, a gnosis, which is intuitively realized within the deepest core of one's being. This is the true meaning of faith. In the language of the West, achieving this knowledge is called salvation. and for the East it is called enlightenment. What could begin to deny self, if there were not something in man different from self? William Law. There are many paths that can lead to this realization, and it is here where traditional religion can be good, as each provides its own roadmap applicable to its respective culture. However, although this can be the means, it is not the ends. When salvation is simply a matter of conversion and adherence to a set of rules, it breeds a complacency that is fatal to actual spiritual growth. Staying in theological debate is to miss the mark as well. Theologians may quarrel, but the mystics of the world speak the same language. Eckhart certainly wasn't the only mystic to realize that simply having a knowledge of words was in no way comparable to the direct experience of what those words are referring to. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most influential theologians in the Western tradition, came to the same realization after his experience of infused contemplation, whereby he declared that everything he had written up until then was, quote, "so much straw after the things that have been revealed to me. I can write no more. I have seen things that make my writings like straw." The direct apprehension of God can be realized in several ways, and at the core of each of these methods is an alteration of consciousness. For instance, certain molecules used in the correct setting is a particularly potent way. Less intense but perhaps equally potent is meditation. A great analogy is the image of the muddy water's sedimentary layer at the bottom. Stillness reveals the pure water. Silencing the mind and being fully present with one's inner being is one of the most tried and true ways, and this state of meditative stillness appears to be a state of consciousness more under attack today than ever before in history. Modern society is indeed allergic to silence. I often wonder about the sheer loss of human creativity and self-expression we face as a result of this war on human attention. It's painful to see meaning, wonder, and curiosity degrade, and to see spiritual practices twisted into trivial, meaningless, goonified TikTok trends. It cannot be stressed enough the significance of cultivating stillness in shaping the trajectory of one's life. As we are all drops in the same ocean, by extension this shapes the future of humanity. Human awareness is perhaps the most profound thing our world has ever produced. And the things we spend our attention on really do matter that much, because this attention is the light that shines outward from God, Brahman, Source. And so the Bible says, "Be still and know that I am God." The concept of an avatar, a divine incarnation of God in human form, is a theme that occurs throughout various religions around the world. While not every religion refers to them as avatars, we can see that these disparate figures do in fact share a lot in common. These figures are often seen as a bridge between the transcendent and immanent, who incarnate into the material world in order to awaken humanity from their self-induced slumber, imparting their teachings and offering wisdom and deliverance. The avatars can be briefly summarized as such. In Hinduism, Vishnu descends into the world in human or animal form to restore Dharma, cosmic order. Krishna is the 8th avatar of Vishnu, who is the divine teacher of the Bhagavad Gita. In Christianity, Jesus Christ is God incarnated in human form, the Word made flesh, Logos, who brings salvation and reconciliation between God and humanity. In Buddhism, a bodhisattva is an enlightened being who voluntarily stays in the material world out of compassion to help others attain enlightenment. Siddhartha Gautama was the historical Buddha, who was later included in the Hindu list of avatars. In Taoism, Lao Tzu is taken to be the embodiment of the Tao, the Way, offering teachings on harmony and transcendence. Earlier on, we briefly acknowledged Karl Jasper's theory of the Axial Age, a groundbreaking interpretation of history as put forward in his book, The Origin and Goal of History. Interestingly enough, nearly all of these figures we associate with the archetype of the avatar, such as Krishna, Lao Tzu, and the Buddha, as well as movements like Confucianism, Zoroastrianism, and Platonism, arose during this pivotal era between the 8th and 3rd centuries BC. The developments of the Axial Age laid the groundwork for the emergence of Christ several centuries later. In this light, the figure of Christ can be seen as the culmination, a mythic flowering of the spiritual and moral transformations that were set in motion during that time. Christianity would thus serve as the platform upon which Western civilization has rested ever since. In this sense, Christ is not an outlier, but rather the culmination of a process, the moment where the divine becomes fully personal, ethical, and embodied. The Axial Age taught humanity how to turn inward. Christianity gave it a universal symbol to mirror that inward transformation. There is indeed a much deeper meaning that emerges when these figures are not seen simply as historical personalities, but as universal archetypes. Jesus, Buddha, Krishna, Lao Tzu could be seen as living bridges between the finite and the infinite, matter and spirit, immanence and transcendence. Each of these transcendental bridges were unique to the time and culture in question. Indeed, much of the conflict surrounding religions appears to result from an obsession with historical fact. Rather, in this light, as archetypes, the appearance of the avatar speaks to the structure and goal of consciousness itself. The Swiss psychologist Karl Jung explored this idea in his work Aion, where he explores the figure of Christ and the symbol of the fish. Through the lens of Christian, Gnostic, and alchemical symbolism, Jung interpreted Christ to be a symbol of the self and his story as the individuation process. Christ as a symbol of the self was understood by Jung to represent the wholeness of being that unites opposites, human and divine, conscious and unconscious, temporal and eternal. While Christ was seen as the exemplar of the individuated self, the Antichrist was seen as the shadow archetype. The idea of Christ dying for the sins of humanity can be seen as a symbol for the individual ego shedding the sins of the self, greed, gluttony, lust, and so on, and to represent at a much deeper level an ego death. For Jung, the figure of Christ represented the archetype of individuation, the inner process by which the fragmented self is reunited with the divine ground. Obviously, the figure and story of Christ goes much deeper than I'm able to get into at this time. In this way, however, the concept of the avatar can be understood both cosmologically and psychologically, as a descent of spiritual truth into the carnal world, and as the awakening of the divine potential within the individual. Whether it is Krishna, Christ, the Buddha, or Lao Tzu, the pattern remains the same. The one descends into the many, so the many may remember the one. It's been said so many times that it's become a bit of a cliché. All is one. We're all connected. These ideas lie at the heart of perennial wisdom, but they are by no means exclusive to it. Such realizations are almost universally felt by individuals who have had a mystical experience with psychedelics. These experiences reveal the illusory nature of the self and the absolute interconnectedness of everything. They make it obvious that the world of sense perception is only a fragment of the absolute, and seem to confirm what the mystics have said all along. The eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. Some proponents of the perennial philosophy, especially those from the traditionalist school, will say that seeking a mystical experience of the divine through altered states of consciousness is like asking for the ends without the means. To that we might say, there are many paths that lead up the mountain. A mystical experience on a psychedelic is certainly not a handout either, and definitely shouldn't be taken lightly, as one can become convinced they have died and the world has ended. If altered states of consciousness lead to the changes in personality as they do, selflessness, empathy, transcendence, then it seems to be an equally valid means. Just like how any language is good for describing human experience, certain languages work better depending on one's culture or geographic location. Chinese is better for Chinese people, for example. If a person is brought up to think about God in one language, it can be difficult for them to think of him in a different one. The same can be said for religion. The rites, sacraments, and ceremonies of religions can be equally valid as well, provided they serve as the means to remind one of the God within. Problems arise within religions when they assert an exclusivity, that only one religious language can be used regardless of culture. The collective conduct of a nation can be seen as a testament to the religion prevailing within it. In his book, Huxley points out how Orthodox Christianity's obsession with historical fact and its assertion that there has and can only be one avatar has resulted in countless bloody crusades, interdenominational wars, and proselytizing imperialism, indeed far more than that of the East. Buddhism's primary concern of the eternal now and the kingdom within has resulted in its being among the most peaceful religions in history. The religions least concerned with historical events in time have consistently been the most tolerant and humane. Because of that one unfortunate verse in Genesis, Western civilization has seen to it that nature must be subdued and conquered, and that this vision must be achieved by any means. Christian mystics like Eckhart really had to be on their toes with the kind of language they used, constantly under threat from the Inquisition's prying eyes. During that time, the Orthodox Church wielded immense institutional power, and they had to walk a very fine line so as to not sound heretical and face condemnation. St. John of the Cross was imprisoned for his mystical writings. Eckhart's writings on the ground of the soul resulted in the Church growing increasingly suspect, but as fate would have it, he died before his verdict was received. Taoist and Zen Buddhist masters were fond of using paradoxes, parables, and non sequiturs in order to startle the reader out of their normal state of self-complacency. Oftentimes this served as the catalyst for transformation, the final metanoia. Because the subject matter of the perennial philosophy is the eternal and ineffable, the ordinary language of the rational intellect can never fully explain it. At best, it can only be hinted at, so that one can realize it for themselves. Meditating on these hard sayings served as a way to break out of the discursive intellect and gain insight into the divine ground of being. And so we find statements like, "What is known as the teaching of the Buddha is not the teaching of the Buddha." One such Eastern parable, though not exactly paradoxical, is the often quoted story of the blind men and an elephant. The story tells of a group of blind men that come across an elephant for the first time and learn what it is like by touching it. Each blind man feels a different part of the animal's body, but only one part, and each form their own opinions about what exactly it is. They try to describe the animal based on their limited perceptions of it, and as their descriptions vary, they inevitably come to disagreements. The moral of the parable is that humans have a tendency of claiming absolute truth based on our limited, subjective experience. We often ignore others who likewise have the same limited subjective experience as us. This parable is quite rich, and at this point we should be able to see how well it could apply to the perennial philosophy. Swap the blind men for the various theologians and mystics, and swap the elephant for God. Individual cultures can only attain so much of an understanding of something infinite and omnipresent, as they are limited by geographical, psychological, and historical vantage points. Quarrels arise between perspectives because some of them have constructed considerable infrastructure in order to get a better view of the divine, and in so doing become reluctant to relocate or rebuild to see it from another angle. It could be said that, from their view, all of the great religions are correct. However, they fall short when they fail to see the bigger picture and sever ties to different perspectives. We can apply this logic to science in the same way as we did with religion. Asking a biologist what the nature of life is will net you a different answer than if you asked a physicist, mathematician, sociologist, or an economist. Granted they are honest, each will answer the question to the best of their knowledge based on their perspective. A physicist might explain the nature of life through the language of particles and waves. A mathematician might do so through chaos theory or fractal mathematics. A sociologist through systems theory and cultural mythologies. Each may be correct in part, but lacking on the whole. The downside is that each discipline tends to become fragmented from the whole and compartmentalized, resulting in a tunnel vision perspective on a phenomenon, life, that is, that couldn't possibly be explained through the language of one discipline alone. And so it seems to be the case of religions grasping for an explanation of God. One of the central tenets of mystical philosophy is the Hermetic idea of as above, so below, as within, so without. and time again we find this axiom ringing true. It seems like the evolution of religious thought and the emergence of perennialism during the Renaissance speaks to a much bigger pattern being played out over the course of human history and life on this planet. Things begin in an undifferentiated unity. This is true according to modern physics, but it certainly doesn't stop there. The individual human ego emerges from a state of undivided embryonic oneness. There is no boundary between self and world, and no sense of I amness, only pure awareness. As consciousness unfolds, it experiences the pains of separation from its source as it is thrust into the cold and unforgiving world of physicality. The story of the Garden of Eden is a story that is pregnant with meaning, as it echoes this exact same pattern. In it, the human ego is dormant, existing in a paradisal realm where all its needs are met, and it resides in a state of unknowing. Eden was the womb, and the expulsion from the garden is the original trauma. That tragic story is the story of the birth of the ego into the world of multiplicity and opposites. In this world, one experiences the greatest of joys to the lowest of sorrows, and at the end of life we return to this unity with the earth and the cosmos, to oneness with the absolute. The esoteric roots of religions begin with an experience of this oneness. Over time, they harden into formal traditions, split into factions, and become institutionalized entities. In a similar way, how the individual begins in the unity of prenatal and pre-egoic childhood, forming a separate ego, forgetting its source, and becoming trapped in division and illusion, the same can be said for religions forming their own hardened, defensive egos. The recent resurgence of interest worldwide in spiritual, theological, mythological, and archetypal ideas might be a clue of a much bigger shift occurring in our collective consciousness. More and more people are seeking knowledge and wisdom. Individuals want to actually know the truth, to directly experience it, rather than simply following the dogma of previous generations. The perennial philosophy is one of those paths. It isn't about flattening out all the world's traditions into one homogeneous thing. Neither does it seek to absolve the mystery of life. Rather, it is a way of communing with that mystery, a way of bringing different perspectives together so that a more integral and holistic view can emerge. As Alfred North Whitehead once said, philosophy begins in wonder, and when philosophy has done its best, the wonder remains. The Tao is more than just a metaphysical truth. It is a way of life, in the same way that Christ said he was the way, the truth, and the life. Truth is a process, and the way forward in that process begins when we learn to look within. Thanks for watching. Till next time, stay curious. Peace.